Section 4. The Vice President's office and State Department officials were aware of, but ignored, concerns relating to Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board. A. Introduction. In early 2015, senior State Department official George Kent raised concerns to staff in the Office of the Vice President about Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board. Kent testified that he never heard anything back from the Vice President's office, and although Kent advised that Hunter Biden should step down from Burisma's board to avoid the perception of a potential conflict of interest, his recommendation was not followed. Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board continued to be an issue State Department officials had to manage when executing U.S.-Ukraine policy. More than a year after Kent reported his concerns to the Vice President's staff, he wrote to his superiors that Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board was very awkward to those on the front lines pushing anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine on a daily basis. Kent testified that he felt the need to prepare everybody for whataboutism, because we're pushing what's right. We have to be prepared for people who are critics, our opponents, to say, well, what about Hunter Biden? Indeed, Kent testified further that he would have advised any American not to get on the board of Zlochevsky's company. The committees are also aware of at least one other senior State Department official, Amos Hochstein, who raised concerns directly to Vice President Biden about potential conflicts of interest relating to Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board. Although Hochstein declined to testify about the substance of his conversation with Vice President Biden, the New Yorker reported that Hochstein did not go so far as to recommend that Hunter leave the board. The committees found that neither the Office of the Vice President nor the State Department ever took any action following these complaints. B. In February 2015, Kent raised concerns about the perception of a conflict of interest regarding Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board. According to Kent, in early 2015, when he was still acting Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, he learned that Hunter Biden was on the board of Burisma. Kent stated, "Soon after that, in a briefing call with the National Security Staff in the Office of the Vice President on other matters, in February 2015, I raised my concern that Hunter Biden's status as a board member could create the perception of a conflict of interest." Kent continued, "I said that I had learned that Hunter Biden had been appointed to a board of this company, that I had just raised U.S. concerns about the owner of the company, who we believed had been engaged in money laundering. The bottom line was, I said I believe that this creates the perception of a potential conflict of interest, given Vice President's role and his very strong advocacy for anti-corruption action, and that I thought that someone needed to talk to Hunter Biden and he should step down from the board of Burisma." When the committees asked Kent who he spoke to in Vice President Biden's office, he stated, "I can't remember, to be perfectly honest. I don't remember who I spoke to." Kent told the committees that after raising this concern, he never heard anything back from the Vice President's office. C. Hunter Biden's association with Burisma continued to be an awkward conflict of interest State Department officials had to manage. Hunter Biden's association with Burisma appeared in numerous State Department records, particularly when state officials discussed the company, its owner, and any corruption efforts in Ukraine. According to records reviewed by the committees, in 2016, Kent mentioned Hunter Biden when discussing Burisma with his colleagues. Kent told the committees, "For me, it's preparing everybody for whataboutism, because we're pushing what's right, and we do what's right, and we have to be prepared for people who are critics, our opponents, to say, well, what about Hunter Biden?" So there was no time, as I've testified, that the U.S. government, the U.S. Embassy, ever made a decision about Zlochevsky, or Burisma, where we took the presence of a private citizen on the board into account. We made the decision on the merits, but others might think otherwise, and so everyone needed to be aware of what we were dealing with as we made the right decisions. The extent to which Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board affected U.S. policy toward Ukraine is not clear. What is clear from the records, however, is that State Department officials, particularly Kent himself, regularly considered how Hunter Biden's connection to Burisma might affect the execution of U.S. policy. Moreover, as described previously, this included having to respond to Russian actors attempting to exploit Hunter Biden's position on Burisma's board to drive a wedge between Ukrainian and the U.S. in an effort to undermine U.S. policy toward Ukraine. For example, Kent raised Hunter Biden's connection to Burisma during multiple discussions over emails involving the Municipal Energy Reform Program, MERP. In those emails, Kent asked his colleagues, "How have we traditionally treated, engaged Burisma, given the Zlochevsky connection, but also perhaps U.S. involvement beyond Hunter Biden?" In another email chain, Kent also pointed out that Zlochevsky put Hunter Biden on the board of his Burisma energy company. When inquiring about the extent to which State Department officials researched Burisma's past in order to determine whether to associate with the company, Kent asked his colleagues whether any know your partner due diligence was done before the partnership between MERP and Burisma was established. Kent then described old news stories involving the company. Zlochevsky, as a corrupt malactor, was a 2014 story, and his control of Burisma and the very sticky wicket of the Hunter Biden connection on Burisma's board was circulating in 2015. As part of that same email chain, Kent asked his colleagues if the U.S. government continues its association with Burisma. Would we want an article on the front page of the Washington Post, and in this case the Kyiv Post, and on the Facebook pages of Sergei Lashenko and Mustafa Nayem, commenting about this public-private partnership with Burisma and the link to Hunter Biden and the link to Zlochevsky, who almost certainly paid off the PGO in December 2014. I had the then First Deputy PG Danylenko tell me the bribe was $7 million to have the case against him closed and his $23 million in assets frozen in the UK unfrozen. So, even though the total amount of time State Department officials spent accounting for Hunter Biden's association with Burisma is unclear, the records show that it was an issue that had to be addressed repeatedly. D. More than 1 year after Kent reported his concerns about Hunter Biden to the Vice President's office, he once again raised the issue, this time to his superiors at the State Department. On September 6, 2016, Kent wrote an email to senior State Department officials, including Deputy Assistant Secretary Bridget Brink and U.S. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, and offered his contemporaneous view of Hunter Biden's association with Burisma. Kent wrote, "The presence of Hunter Biden on the Burisma board was very awkward for all U.S. officials pushing an anti-corruption agenda in Ukraine." In testimony, Kent expanded on this comment. "I meant that people who talk the talk need to walk the walk. And for the U.S. government, collectively, when we talk about the need to have high standards of integrity, again, as I've said, the presence of Hunter Biden on the board created the perception of a potential conflict of interest." The committees learned, through document requests, that Victoria Nuland, then Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, also received a forwarded copy of Kent's September 2016 email outlining his concerns about Hunter Biden being on Burisma's board. Nuland testified that she was always open to hearing the concerns of subordinates and trying to address them in an open and transparent manner. Yet, when the committee asked Nuland to explain what action she took when she received Kent's email, she said that Kent's concerns about Hunter Biden were clearly way deep down in an email late in 2016, and they were not brought to my specific attention by George Kent, who was an old friend and had plenty of opportunity to do so had he so wanted. Despite senior State Department officials clearly being made aware of the situation, Kent's concerns remained unaddressed. E. Hochstein spoke to Vice President Biden about concerns relating to Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board because, according to Hochstein, Russians were using it to advance disinformation. According to testimony and public records, Hochstein, then U.S. Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs, raised concerns about Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board directly to Vice President Biden. Nuland told the committees, Amos Hochstein had had a conversation with the Vice President and his staff about this, and he also had another conversation on the plane ride to Ukraine for that December 2015 trip. Public reporting also confirms Hochstein's discussion with Vice President Biden. According to one report, Amos Hochstein, the Obama administration's special envoy for the energy policy, raised the matter with Biden, but did not go so far as to recommend that Hunter leave the board. When Hochstein testified before the committees, he declined on advice of counsel to testify about the substance of his conversation with Vice President Biden. The New Yorker, however, reported that Hochstein did not go so far as to recommend that Hunter leave the board. It is unclear how Vice President Biden responded to this conversation. According to Hochstein, he raised this issue with Vice President Biden because he was concerned that the Russians were using Hunter Biden's role with the Burisma to sow disinformation. Hochstein recounted that he spoke with Vice President Biden in the West Wing of the White House on October 2015. When asked why he decided to raise the issue of Hunter Biden's position on the Burisma's board with Vice President Biden, Hochstein testified, "We were starting to think about a trip to Ukraine, and I wanted to make sure that he, Vice President Biden, was aware that there was an increase in chatter on media outlets close to Russians and corrupt oligarchs-owned media outlets about undermining his message to try to undermine his, Vice President Biden's, message, and including Hunter Biden being part of the board of Burisma." Hochstein also raises concerns about Russian disinformation with Hunter Biden. Shortly after his conversation with Vice President Biden, Hunter Biden contacted Hochstein and asked to meet. According to Hochstein, Hunter became aware of Hochstein's West Wing conversation with the vice president, who had mentioned it to Hunter. Hochstein described what he and Hunter Biden discussed in this November 2015 meeting at a coffee shop in Georgetown. Question: and could you expand on that? Why did you discuss Burisma with him? Hunter Biden. Hochstein: well, he, Hunter Biden, asked me for a meeting. I think he wanted to know my views on Burisma and Zlochevsky, and so I shared with him that the Russians were using his name in order to sow disinformation, attempt to sow disinformation among Ukrainians. During the November 2015 conversation with Hunter Biden, Hochstein did not recommend that Hunter leave Burisma's board because he did not believe that was my place to have that discussion, one way or the other. F. Conclusion. Hunter Biden's role on Burisma's board hindered the efforts of dedicated career service individuals who are fighting for anti-corruption measures in Ukraine. Because the vice president's son had a direct link to a corrupt company and its owner, State Department officials were required to maintain situational awareness of Hunter Biden's association with Burisma. Unfortunately, U.S. officials had no other choice but to endure the awkwardness of continuing to push an anti-corruption agenda in Ukraine while the vice president's son sat on the board of a Ukrainian company with a corrupt owner, earning tens of thousands of dollars a month. As Kent testified, he would have advised any American not to get on the board of Zlochevsky's company. Yet, even though Hunter Biden's position on Burisma's board cast a shadow over the work of those advancing anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine, the committees are only aware of 2 individuals who raise concerns to their superiors. Despite the efforts of these individuals, their concerns appear to have fallen on deaf ears.